Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today for this session, Responding to the Moment, a Case Study. My name is Rebecca Mushter. I'm a faculty member at SUNY Oswego. I teach in the Department of Art and Design, and I teach primarily interaction design courses. I'm also the co-host of the Tea for Teaching podcast, and I'm mentioning that only because it's important to this presentation, in that role, I often have the opportunity to interview and discuss and have conversation with some really wonderful um, educators and experts on pedagogy and who have really been leaders in the conversation around teaching during a pandemic and has really given me the opportunity to be exposed to maybe a lot more of that information than I would have been otherwise. And so during the last 2 years, I've been taking a lot of that information and trying to digest how to kind of meet students in this moment to provide a really positive experience for everybody. So a lot of the things that I'm sharing are ideas that I've gotten from that work related to the podcast. So the class that I'm going to share as a case study is my web design course. It's a course that I teach every semester. It's also a stack courses, meaning there's a 300, 400, and 500 level class that all meets together. This is a practice that's somewhat common in the arts. I have been teaching for the last 2 years synchronously online, so primarily using Zoom. And my class is a studio class, meaning that it meets for 6 hours a week. And in this last 2 semesters, it has met 3 times a week for 2 hours during each meeting time. So it might be a longer amount of time than maybe some other folks teach during. The challenges that I was really trying to kind of address that I was seeing really tied to this one idea of students were either really successful during this time or really struggling. And I had very few students in the middle, which was very contrary to previous experiences prior to the pandemic. One of the things that I became really aware of was mental and physical health issues of students. I started doing anonymous surveys, check-ins related to mental health, and was really shocked to find how many of my students had contemplated suicide, even within the last month of whenever I had executed these surveys. So that level of kind of really kind of scary mental health challenges was something that really had me paying attention to students and their well-being and wanting to make sure that I was supporting them as best as possible. With COVID going on, obviously, there was also a lot of physical health issues as well, students needing to quarantine and getting medical care, et cetera. Technology was an issue during any remote teaching. It's an issue when it's not remote teaching, right? Laptops break, et cetera. Things that technology practices that students are used to sometimes go awry with Wi-Fi being not available or not working right, or computers not working, et cetera. In my classes, I've had an ongoing perception of workload that seemed to magnify during this time. This particular class often has kind of this perception of a really high workload, in part because students are learning some really new technical skills. And for many of them, it's the first time they've learned something that feels really entirely new in a very long time. So for example, students in other design classes may, rely on the same software packages. So they don't have like the technical leveling up that needs to happen as much as, maybe the conceptual development or the design skills. But in my class, students are learning to, create web pages, and they're writing HTML and CSS. And for many of them, they've never done any sort of coding activity before. So it feels really, really new, and it feels really, really hard. And then the other thing that I was really noticing was some time management, high levels of distraction, and maybe not the most effective use of time that they were spending outside of class. So my goals were to really increase and foster community and belonging within my class to help with some of the isolation that students were feeling. I wanted to provide flexibility, especially with all the health and wellness issues that students were facing, not to mention a lot of the other kind of social issues that we've been addressing in the last few years. And I wanted to increase student agency so that they could kind of have a little more ownership over their learning, but while also providing structure and organization and scaffolding to really help students feel supported during this learning. So the 4 experiments I'm going to share with you are my attempts to address some of these issues and reach some of these goals. So I tried 4 things over the last year consistently over both semesters. I tried something called daily warm-ups, persistent groups, ungrading, and daily recaps. And I'm going to go through each one, share what my practice was. In other words, like how did I implement it? And then what some of the strengths were of that practice and some of the challenges that I faced. So the first thing that we did were daily warm-ups. And this was a transitional exercise that was at the beginning of the class. Usually they were very short. It did also help with students who might be facing technical issues trying to join class. Like it just kind of allowed for some flexibility at the beginning of class. These ranged in activities from kind of getting to know you kind of questions that might be more typical of like a whiteboarding activity, design prompts and challenges, and then also drawing prompts that were maybe more about kind of being present in the moment, trying to facilitate some relaxation and stress reduction, etc. In this case, these activities were facilitated with an online interactive whiteboarding application called Miro. The image on the screen, shows a woman kind of taking a walk in a tree-lined path, sun shining, kind of waking up with maybe some exercise. And this is the same kind of idea of kind of going for that nice refreshing walk before you start and sit down and focus. That was kind of the idea behind these warm-ups. Students in reflection assignments reported that they really appreciated this transition time from kind of either changing classes from one class to another, or from waking up to going to class, or from kind of transitioning from kind of their personal lives to their kind of education and schooling. A lot of students also reported in their reflection assignments that they adopted some of these techniques to transition into homework time or into their kind of creative practice outside of class time. And in general, there were really high levels of participation in these warm-ups. Sometimes the activities were very slow, sometimes they were very fast, but they were all very short in terms of time. Some of the challenges that I faced with the daily warm-ups were the length. So some of the ideas that I had were things that took more than like 5 minutes. And so they kind of expanded more into exercises to start the class period rather than a true warm-up. And that's something that I want to work on in the future, is really kind of differentiating between these kind of wake-up, warm-up kind of activities versus maybe some of these transitional exercises that get to really important topics. For example, I did a couple of Kahoots to practice some of the technical concepts and ideas, and students really responded positively to doing those kinds of like fun game show like quizzes, but they also took a while and really started elevating to a level beyond a warm-up. So that was something that I struggled with a bit over the course of the year. I also struggled with ideas. I tried to do warm-ups so that all 3 levels of the class were doing the same warm-ups, which is challenging when some of those same students might have had me the previous semester. So I needed to have like more ideas so that it didn't seem repetitive for those students. And then I had wanted to do some small group warm-ups, but facilitating that and getting students into breakouts and just was a little bit clunky and time consuming. So I tended to do things that were individual warm-ups. And then we came together as a group to kind of just talk about either share the outcome of that warm-up or to talk a little bit about what that particular kind of activity felt like for each student. We'd keep those short to 5 to 10 minutes for the most part, except for when they creeped into things that weren't warm-ups anymore. Another practice that we tried was persistent groups. I've always done a lot of collaborative work in my web design classes, but during the pandemic, with kind of continuous illness and mental health challenges that students were facing is that a lot more group members were unreliable in ways that they hadn't been previously, right? So we always have unreliable group members, but this was to the extreme where it just didn't seem fair to students to have to work together when there were so many challenges that they were facing. So what I did instead was I did create persistent groups that were 3 to 4 students that lasted the whole semester. I grouped students that had different backgrounds so that they could complement each other with skills. So students with different majors, for example. And they did do some collaborative work together, but none of that work was graded and none of that work spanned beyond the scope of the class time. The strengths of persistent groups. So obviously this is like my ideal, right? There's like 4 students, they're engaged, they're talking around a table, they're working together. Sometimes I think students feel like when they're in groups, it's like they're trying to navigate the rapids of, the technical challenges of web design, and it feels like much more of an adventure or high stakes than maybe it is meant to be. But the students really responded in their reflection papers by saying that the relationships that they built were meaningful, right? That they felt connected to other students in the class. They had a cohort of students that they could rely on and ask questions of. They appreciated the consistency of working with that group regularly for feedback and things so that they didn't always have to kind of start over and introduce themselves. And they really used that group to troubleshoot and to get feedback pretty consistently. It didn't always look like that to me from the outside, but when students were reflecting on their experiences, they highlighted a lot of these with really specific examples. The challenges that I found were that they were hard to monitor in a Zoom environment because they couldn't kind of get a snapshot of what was happening in each room without having to hop between the rooms, which is different than being in class and in a physical environment. One of the challenges that I experienced more this year than last year was a higher rate of withdrawals and just disappearing students. So this became problematic for groups that were only 3 or 4 students in the first place. So for example, I had one group of 4 that by midterms was a group of 2. So if one of those 2 students was missing, then they no longer had a group. So that became a real challenge for that particular group. And then the other thing that students raised is that they really appreciated having this cohort to kind of trust and work together, but they wanted to have more opportunities to share progress with the whole class and do a more traditional full class critique, which we did do more so at the second half of the semester. And they wanted to see this more. So one of the things that I implemented was using Miro to do some for feedback. So I would use timed opportunities for students to present their work, and then offer the opportunity for all students to provide some written feedback in like a sticky note format with like strengths and weaknesses of in progress work in Miro. So that allowed a place to gather all those notes really consistently and effectively, and allowed students to interact and have conversations with each other. Susan in the discussion forum asked, did you provide info about team dynamics to the student groups? Kind of a meta learning. Yeah, we did a lot of, one of the things that I do a lot in my web design class is introduce that web design is a collaborative experience. So we do a lot of activities to help foster that collaboration. I had to dial back some of those things in this model because they weren't getting graded together. So some of the things that I had done in the past, like kind of like a postmortem kind of activities where you would do things at the end of a cycle of something or at the end of a sprint of something where you'd give feedback with as a group using kind of a whiteboarding activity or doing some peer evaluation. I didn't do as much of that in this time, but I did have students consistently reflect on their collaboration with their peers and contributing to the conversations and the work of their peers. Miro is a new tool for them in my classes, but I use it consistently across my classes, and other design faculty in my department also use Miro. But I did have to introduce Miro as a tool to them and how to use it. And we did activities at the very beginning. A lot of the warm-ups in the beginning were just like how to use Miro. So that's something that we did. So the other experiment that I tried was a variation of ungrading. And this was a very big adventure. I was anxious about it because I was concerned about equity issues related to it, but I also could see the power and that the kind of philosophy of ungrading really matched my philosophy of teaching and the way that I want students to embrace the learning process rather than always the outcomes. So what I did this semester is slightly shift like how many assignments were actually submitted. So there were a number of no stakes exercises, and those no stakes exercises were just things that weren't included in portfolios and were not submitted at all. In the past, those are things that I would have had students submit. Instead, they submitted a portfolio of work over the course of the semester, and that portfolio of work consisted of one long-term project that happened in 4 stages, and at each stage, they got feedback and could make revisions, and then 2 smaller assignments, one around midterm and one around the final, that were also kind of creative projects. Those projects had a little more creative latitude than the like bigger project. With those at 4 increments during the semester, about every quarter of the semester, there was a reflection assignment. At midterm and final, those reflection assignments were a little bit more robust and were kind of raised to the level of a reflective self-evaluation. After those reflective self-evaluations, I would have a one-on-one conference with a student to talk about their portfolio and their reflection. In that reflection, I also had them essentially grade themselves using some guidelines of like what exceeds expectations, what meets expectations, etc. And then when they submitted work, I marked the work as complete or incomplete. Incomplete work had to be resubmitted so that the assignment was actually complete. And then I provided, written or qualitative feedback, kind of almost like an end note. I also left sticky notes and things inside of process books that they did, and line by line code notes when it was relevant to the work that they were doing. The strengths of this was that the work submitted was strong overall. It wasn't, you might fear that not having grades in a traditional way would somehow make the work weaker, and it didn't. It was pretty consistent with the work that I had expected in previous semesters. I was able to calibrate the level of challenge for students a little more effectively. So students that were really catching on to things really quickly, I could quickly level them up and give them a level of challenge where they felt like they were getting something out of the course. And that students that were really struggling, I could help them sort through like the options and get down to like, what are the key things that you really need to learn so that you've got a basic and strong foundation. And I would help them kind of sort through that. One of the things that I thought was a really wonderful outcome is that students took more risks. And these would be maybe some of the students that you would think of as maybe typically stronger students who would maybe just always do the safe thing and never try anything new. These students took risks like I'd never seen before, which was really wonderful. In part because there was less pressure at any given time. They could make mistakes and recover and not have to worry about it. Students responded in their reflections about really enjoying the iterative approach and wish that all of the projects had that opportunity. There was kind of that opportunity, it was built more into the bigger project. And they appreciated having fewer assignments submitted, as did I. The challenges were, some of it was timing. So timing more so for students and not always like realizing how urgent something was. So I need to work on that. One of the things that, they had access to me for coaching throughout our class periods on a regular basis and could schedule one-on-one appointments, but I found that students were trying to use our conferences related to the reflection assignments to troubleshoot their projects. And that really needs to be a separate activity. And so that was a challenge that I faced, and I just didn't know because I had never done these like one-on-one conferences before to know what to expect. I still had some struggling students, and I don't know that those students struggled necessarily because of the ungrading, but perhaps having a grade that was not that was an F, right, or a D early on would have motivated them to take action a little sooner. Some of the students kind of mentioned that, but some of the other students that were struggling just said it wasn't a class that was a priority for them. They were getting close to graduation and were prioritizing other things, and that's why they were struggling. The other thing that came up in some of the conferences is that kind of effort and time does not necessarily equate to learning or achievement. So one of the things that I was thinking is that students weren't spending time outside of class, but when I had these conferences or reading their reflections, they're telling me that they're spending all this time outside of class, but they're just kind of they're spinning their wheels, they're going in circles and not moving forward. So one of the things that I need to work on is really helping students realize when they're stuck and what they're stuck on so that they can get help and articulate kind of what they need. The last kind of thing that I tried this semester was a daily recap. I had done something similar during the first semester of the pandemic where I did weekly recaps that kind of summarized the previous week and then kind of did a preview of the week coming up. This time I did it on a daily, after each class. So I would summarize the class activities. I would link to the class recordings. I would share reminders about deadlines, and then I would give them almost like a checklist of things to do to be well prepared for their time next class. What I was trying to do was get students to use our studio time to work on their projects and to troubleshoot and get help. And so some of the non-technical things would be things that they would need to do outside of class to be really prepared for that and be prepared for those experiences. Michelle in the chat noted in the chat that monotasking is my new mantra in this regard. I think they, like we all, spend a great deal of time thinking we are doing focused work, and that is not the case. Yes, definitely. And I had some really good conversations with students this semester about how they were spending class time and ways that they could use that time more efficiently to get better results. Students really liked these recaps. It provided some scaffolding, reminders. I was able to provide relevant resources where I saw students struggling, and I reminded them about ways that they could get help. And then the challenges that I faced were really just like scheduling the time to write the recaps. It's not like they were really long or hard or difficult things to do, but they do require some time. And sometimes they became a little long, in part because I had stack classes and I wanted to not have to write 3 recaps. I wanted to write 1 recap. So I would do kind of the things that they had in common and then use headings to differentiate the different class levels and things that they would need to do to be prepared. But that did make it a little long. And I think that some of the advanced students who were lower on the, farther down on the page, perhaps didn't read those as often. And some of the students who would really have benefited from those recaps weren't always using them. So that was an ongoing challenge. But overall, I think it was a worthwhile endeavor, but I need to kind of streamline that process a little bit more. One of my goals here was to kind of reduce some of the cognitive load of kind of getting organized by just providing the organizational structure and providing these regular checklists so that students knew exactly what they had to do and they didn't need to go look it up in various places in the learning management system. Because some things were homework but weren't submitted, right? Versus things that are submitted and they show up differently. So I would just summarize these things and these regular kind of course announcements that I also sent as emails. So that they had it and they could expect it, and it was something that they could rely on. So as I reflect on all of these things, what I really want to do is get students to kind of be like the toes at the bottom of the page here that are approaching the words passion, led us here, right? So that students are really able to capitalize more on choice and agency, to stay engaged and to be motivated to do the work. One of the things that I really have learned, I think, is that there's only so many things that pedagogy can solve. There's a lot of challenges that students were facing that were far beyond things that I can address as an instructor in a class. But the things that I could control, I was trying to improve and will continue to do that. So student choice is something I want to find ways to build in more. The students really liked the smaller projects that we did because they had more choice, but they also really liked the big project that had less choice but had far more structure. So I need to find a balance there. And then the other thing that I want to do is reduce the number of reflection assignments to 3 and increase the conferences to 3 so that it happens kind of every third of the semester, just to kind of spread the work out a little bit more over the course of the semester, and to intervene a little bit earlier for some students. So those are my plans moving forward. I'm happy to address questions that folks have about some of the processes that I tried or the practices I tried. Um, so feel free to continue using the chat. It was a really great experience teaching synchronously online over the last couple of years, but now I'm also in the process of figuring out how to transition some of these practices back to the classroom as I move back to in-person teaching this fall. I think most of these practices I will maintain. They might look slightly different, but I think they'll all still be there, and were worthwhile endeavors to try out this semester. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them if you want to pop them in the discussion forum. Otherwise, thank you so much for your attention and contributions to the conversation in the chat. Thanks, Kristen. Things I could control, I tried to improve. That's a good one to remember. I keep trying to remember that myself, Kristen, and remind myself that I can't control everything. All right. Thanks, everyone. Yeah. Okay. I think we're all wrapped up. I don't see any more questions in the chat. Okay. Thank you.